This is our last session on stories in the Bible that we don't have in our normal lessons on Sunday. And the story of Paul's shipwreck. And we'll look at some of the things going on at that time that had an influence on what happened in that story. Galatians 4 tells us when the time had fully come, God sent his Son. And when we look at this back historically, we see how flawless God's timing was. I think of it as being kind of like a quarterback who knows just the right time to throw the ball. You think he could throw it sooner and be safer, but he waits till that extra split second so the receiver gets open better, even though it means he gets hammered in the process. That's kind of what God did with the sending of Jesus. Because there was peace at that time with the Roman Empire. And this peace was to last for a while, which is very important for the spread of the gospel. It happens better in peacetime than in the confusion of war. Also, you had the spread of the Jews, and you see those dark-colored areas where Jewish influence was throughout the world. And wherever Jews went, they had their synagogues, and wherever the synagogues were, there was the proclamation of God's word. And what had happened about 100 years before the birth of Jesus, they had translated the Old Testament Hebrew into Greek, the Septuagint, which means a lot of times what was read was in Greek, which was the commercial language of the Roman Empire. So wherever you were, you could hear that, and you had a lot of Gentiles influenced by it. And again, this common language, which made it very easy to spread the gospel. Also the failure of the ancient religions. People were realizing they were just fables, they weren't helping them. Also this real desire for the coming of the Messiah. You see here these old Hebrew writings in the rabbis, the Targums. There's a lot of anticipation for the Messiah to come, and we see that in the reaction of people to Jesus. You also had the Roman road system. The roads were so well built. Here you see how they built them, that now, over 2,000 years later, you can still drive on those roads. Yeah. And that really is important because the Mediterranean world, if you know anything about the Mediterranean, a Mediterranean climate means it's hot and dry except during the winter. In winter, it's rainy. We had a girl here who came to church all the time. Her dad worked for the UN food program, which is based in Rome. And she remembers about growing up in Rome is every Christmas it rained. And with that rain, that meant in the wintertime, it was abject mud. And you could really not travel anywhere until the Romans built the roads. They also protected the sea. They got rid of the pirates. And here you see the great sailors of the ancient world, the Phoenicians, which allowed people to travel easily through the Mediterranean. And here you see the colonies that the Carthaginians had set up, the Phoenicians, including Carthage. And that meant that the Mediterranean world was connected. And later on, the Greeks added to it. And you see their trade routes. So this is all really important for the spread of the gospel. Here's the typical Greek cargo ship, which gives us an idea, and we get this from archaeological records, of what Paul was actually traveling in. Here you see, for the Greeks, how important sailing was. And even though the Romans had ships, their sailors, their builders were either Greek or Phoenician. Now, when they navigated mainly by looking at the seacoast. They could also check direction through the sun at north from the North Star, but they didn't have anything real sophisticated. So generally, when they sailed, they tried to stay within sight of land. You didn't have until the mid-1500s the development, before that, of more specific kinds of navigation to go in the open ocean. Think of Christopher Columbus, who used something called dead reckoning. And when you do dead reckoning, you use what's called a log. What do you mean by log? Well, they'd actually take a log and throw it in the water, and then they would lead it out with a rope. And as they did that, they would have a sand timer, and they would then determine the direction and the speed of the current. So they called a log. And they would keep very careful records of their direction using a compass, the direction of the winds and the speed of the winds, the speed of the current, and direction of the current. And they would just keep that very carefully again and again. They talked about a ship's log. That's where it came from. And that's how Christopher Columbus navigated in the open ocean without any sight of land. But they didn't have that back then. They also knew about prevailing winds. They knew that when you went west, you would go north in the Mediterranean. When you go east, you would go towards the south. They also developed the principle, what's called tacking. This is when you're going against the wind. You can't just go straight into the wind, so what you do is you go diagonally, and the wind, even though it's blowing at you, blows you kind of this way at an angle, and you go back and forth. It's much slower, much more complicated than going with the prevailing winds, but it enables you to go against the winds. But they would try to the best of their ability, to be able to travel with the prevailing winds. And this is the Mediterranean Sea, the center of the Roman Empire. They called it in Latin Mare Nostrum, which means our sea. Roman cargo ships, like the one Paul was in, were probably 100 and 150 tons. Some of them were bigger, but generally that much. And they were not rivaled in size until the 1500s. You know, think about Christopher Columbus and the great age of discovery. They also had their rudders on the side. Now, you've heard starboard and port. Starboard's right, port's left. Where'd they get that from? Well, the Old English starboard, steering board. That's where the steering board was. So that was the right side. And the left side was called port because when you went to the dock, you'd always want to be on the left side because you didn't want to wreck your rudder. And they didn't develop really the mid-back rudder until later in the Middle Ages, which made much better travel. But at that point, your steering board was on the right side. Here's an uncovered Roman anchor. You see how substantial it was? And those anchors are real important because they enable you to stop before you crash into places. Here is Corinth, which is an important seaport. It's kind of halfway across the Mediterranean. But what is also helpful is with them hugging the coast, that south coast of the Peloponnese, southern part of Greece, is very treacherous and rocky. So what they did is instead of going around that, they would stop at Corinth and take supplies over that narrow isthmus, or even they actually took the ships out themselves. Here is the port of Ostia. That's the port for Rome. Rome is inland a little bit, and you can see how it was artificially made. And you see all the building, the structures to provide a port. But here is what they did at Corinth. They had a road across the isthmus, and you can still see that today, parts of it, and they would take the ship and put it on wheels and cross across the isthmus. It's called the Diolkos. There you see part of it. And of course, in the modern age, they built a canal there. Here's the port of Ephesus. Again, a man-made port. You go to Ephesus today, and it's inland. The river, the area was totally filled in. It's no longer a port. But they had a narrow inlet of the sea, and they built a circular place where they could turn around ships. The same thing they did in the early 20th century to Houston, because Houston's on a bayou, and they built a turning basin so that the ships could come in and turn around. Here you see typical merchant ship, the type that Paul would have been. Notice what's at the bottom. Rocks for ballast, very important. And you see they used a lot of pottery to put the supplies in, because pottery would keep things, preserve things, and also keep it from getting wet. So lots of things were transported from various areas, And this made for commercialism, for prosperity, but also spread of culture and spread of ideas. So if you're a guy like St. Paul and you start a church in Corinth, you're not just affecting Corinth, Greece, you're really influencing the whole Mediterranean world. One of the reasons why the Romans were able to conquer, they weren't great sailors, but they developed this thing called a corvus, which was a ramp that would fall down and lock into their enemy's ship. And what the Romans were good at is being soldiers. So using this, they were able to defeat their enemies and take control of the seas. And you see a Roman warship versus a Roman trade ship. As you can see, the Roman warship is a galley. It depends not only on the sails, but on the rowing oars. And you remember from the movie Ben-Hur, who did the rowing? Slaves, exactly. But the Roman trade ship, as you can see, has none of that because it's a commercial venture. You don't want to have to afford to take care of all those slaves. It's all about economy. You see, it's a much broader, it's designed to carry a lot of cargo, not to go fast. And again, notice the rudder on the right side, not in the back. Now, wintertime, even today, if you are a sailing person, you're advised not to sail in the Mediterranean because that's the stormy time. They called it in Latin mare clausum, sea closed. 4 months during the winter where you didn't seafare. And what was happening with Paul is it's getting close to winter and they're trying to get through before that happens. And then they get stuck off course and they're looking for a place to winter and they can't find it. This is the famous Gulf Stream that we think of here in this country. Why is the Gulf Stream so important? It starts in the Gulf of Mexico and works its way up. Why is it so important? You see up there where England is on the top right side? Now, if you go across from England, what latitude are you over in Canada? Oh, no, much further north. Yeah, well, not quite Greenland, but you're up North Labrador. The area that in Canada is basically almost frozen. Why isn't England and Northern Europe frozen? It should be by its latitude because of the current, because of the Gulf Stream. If it wasn't for the Gulf Stream, Northern Europe would be kind of like Northern Canada. It enables that to happen. It also, though, means if you're going to travel by sail across the Atlantic, how do you do it? Well, if you're going to go from the Americas to the England, you take the northern route and you hug the American coast and you take the Gulf Stream and it leads you to England. But if you're going to go west to the Americas, then you go south by Spain and you get the currents off the coast of Africa and that takes you across. So when you're Christopher Columbus, how did you cross the ocean? You go to the north route or the south route? And because of that, where did Columbus end up? In the Caribbean, not in the northern part. And that's how they would go. They'd go on that circular route, the trade. Maybe you remember the time of the American Revolution, the famous triangle, where you'd have goods coming from Europe to the Caribbean, and on their way they'd pick up slaves in Africa, take them to the Caribbean, where the big thing was molasses. And the molasses was taken to the colonies where they'd make rum out of it. And they'd also have some of the slaves. And then they'd pick up in the colonies things like wood and tar, which you would use for your ships, and grain, and then they would go across back to England. And they'd have that constant trade going on, making use of those circles. But even then, with that, just like the Mediterranean, when did you not travel? You didn't travel during hurricane season. They just avoided sailing during that time because they knew you're going to be in trouble. They weren't constantly traveling year-round to the colonies. It would be seasonal, based on the trade winds. So here, you see, from June to November, you didn't really want to go that way. Now, from November to January, you go east to west, and from March to May, you go west to east, because that's the way to avoid tornadoes and things like that. So why does Paul want to go to Rome? Why is he even going to Rome in the first place? Well, he's on trial, and well, how do you get arrested in the first place? How did Paul get arrested in the first place? He's in Jerusalem, and a panic is caused by his enemies. They're about to cause a riot, and he's brought before their council. And he plays a very clever thing. He says, the reason why I'm on trial before the Jewish council is because I believe in the resurrection of the dead. Now, half of the Jewish council is Pharisees, the other half is Sadducees. It's kind of like the Democrats, Republicans of his time. Normally, they're at each other's throat, but they were united in their execution of Jesus. And they're kind of united to try to stop Paul, who's preaching Jesus. But then when he says, I'm here because I believe in the resurrection of the dead, that's a cardinal tenet of the Pharisees, and it's rejected by the Sadducees. So by saying that, he gets them arguing with each other, and they don't finish taking care of him. He leaves, and then it's discovered by his nephew that there's a plot to assassinate him. So Paul has him go to the Roman official, and the Roman official gets a guard of soldiers and writes a letter and has him go from Jerusalem to Caesarea on the coast where the Roman governors. And what happens is Paul spends years kind of on house arrest in that area in Caesarea, brought before various people. You have Roman officials who kind of hold off because they don't want to have to deal with it. And finally, Paul, in the midst of that, says, I appeal to Caesar. Because as a Roman citizen, he had that right, just like we have the right to appeal to the Supreme Court. That's what he was on his way to Rome for that purpose. Okay, we'll start reading from Acts 27. Somebody read.
When it was decided that we would sail for Italy.
Okay, notice the person. What person pronoun? The pronoun, what person is that?
Paul.
It's we. First person. What does that tell us? Luke is involved, and Luke's a part of this. Continue.
No. Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. Most Roman military came from the peoples of the conquered lands. That imperial regiment was truly Roman.
So this is really a top-notch. This is not. This is the good guard. Keep going.
We boarded a ship from
Adramyttium,
about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia.
Asia is modern-day Turkey. You see, there's the path that they're supposed to be taking.
And we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so he might provide for his needs.
Okay, so they go up to Sidon, which is, you see they're starting in Caesarea on the coast, to go up to Sidon, which is in modern-day Lebanon. Why were the Roman officials so kind to Paul?
He
was a Roman citizen. Yeah. And he had impressed the Romans because he had always followed the laws and so forth. With our friend Kebet in Ethiopia, what is the relationship of him and the churches he works with and the Ethiopian government? What kind of relationship do they have? The Ethiopian government today wants to be totally not associated with any religion. It doesn't want to favor any religion. How does the Lutheran Church in Ethiopia then relate to the church in a very poor, the government, in a poor way or very good way? Very good way, because they're seen as honoring the government in doing that. The problem that the government in Ethiopia has with time and again is with Muslims, because Muslims don't obey the law. They don't work according to the law. With our Lutheran principle of you obey the local governments, as St. Paul talks about in Romans chapter 13, we follow that principle. And that's why Lutherans have always got along well with the government, because the understanding is you do obey the government. And Paul did that, and that's why they were kind to him. 1 Timothy 2. Somebody read here.
I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving may be made for all people, for kings and all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. From there,
Okay. So if that's the kind of advice that Paul gives, how do you think Christians were received by the Roman government originally? Very well. It was only later on that persecuted. At first, they got along really well because these are good citizens. These are good people. Okay, now we continue back in Acts with Luke's account. Don, you're doing great.
There we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us.
Lee is, what does lee mean? Lee means on the back side of it. You have windward and leeward. Windward is the side the wind is on. Lee is on the other side. Sailing people will talk about what they call wind gauge. And the wind gauge is to have the wind behind you. You have the advantage. Well, they're not. They're on the other side. They're being blown south. Of course, they want to be on the north side because the currents take them west, but they're being blown south by this north wind. All right? And you see there the windward side and the leeward side. All right? And you see they're being blown south from where they were in Turkey towards Crete, which is off course. That's not the way they wanted, because the currents north of Crete are going to take you west. South of Crete, they're going to take you east. But of course, they're going to be driven by all kinds of crazy winds, not knowing where they're going. Okay, continue, Don.
We had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia. We landed at Myra and Lycia.
That's the last place they are in Turkey. Okay? And you see them blown south after that.
And there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus.
Cnidus, they do a lot of tacking. And Cnidus, after that, they're driven south.
When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salome.
So they're going to be on the south side of Crete. You see them there? All right, and they go past Salome there.
We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lycia.
So you see Fair Havens where they are. It's a place where they had a break from the north wind, but it's not a permanent harbor. It's not a year-round harbor. They can't stay there. They can't survive the winter there.
Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous, because by now it was after the Day of Atonement.
Okay, so now he's given us time by the Old Testament. When is the Day of Atonement? Today it's called, in Hebrew, it's called Yom Kippur. When do the Jews celebrate Yom Kippur? September, October. It's late in the season. Now, Don would know that. What baseball pitcher never pitched on Yom Kippur? Sandy Koufax. This is it about you. Okay, so this is late fall. Continue, Don.
Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there.
And Phoenix, you see, is on the western side. There's a permanent harbor there. They're planning to winter there, but they never make it. And again, you see the Mediterranean currents, that if you want to go west, you want to be north, because otherwise the prevailing currents are going to take you to the east. So they're going into a mixed up area. We'll also know this from the Mediterranean climate, that again, in that part of the world, you see the rainfall, how the rainfall is, and the temperatures, they're just the opposite. The high temperatures are in the summer, and it's the winter months you have the lower temperatures and the rain. We think of that area as being primarily desert, and it is, but in the winter months, it's a quagmire of mud. if you study any World War II history, do I have it? Maybe I don't. Yeah. The United States forces landed in November in Tunisia. And for the first 3-4 months, November, December, January, February, March, this is what they experienced. Awful mud, rain, storms, things like that. Another example of that kind of weather system is what you have in San Francisco, where you have your precipitation is going to be highest in the winter months, and your temperature is going to be sometimes and the sunniest weather is going to be sometimes during the fall and things like early fall. But you see the difference there too as well. Similar kind of climate to what you have there. Also happened in Italy when we were fighting in 1944, the winter in 43, 44, 44, 45, again, mud. Or we think of the California mudslides. All right, and here you see the prevailing winds in the area. The one that really is influencing Paul at this time is that Bora from the north. The Scirocco winds, they're what come during the summertime, because what will happen is the water will heat up and cool later than the land, because water holds on to temperature better. So in the late summer, as the water really starts to warm up and it starts to having cooling more in the winter, you have these winds coming up from the desert, just like it would in California. Late summers when you get the Santa Ana winds, as they're called. But on the other hand, in the winter, just the opposite. It's gotten colder over in the land, and there's still some warmth in the air of the sea, and so you'll have pumped into there the cool air from the north. And there's the Bora. You think of the aurora borealis. That's the northern lights. Well, Bora is the Greek word for night. And this is the sailor, from modern sailor. When the winds reach force 10 with gusts of force 11 to 12, the waves are only 12 feet high. Yeah. Now, the waves aren't going to be as high because it's shallower than what you have in the ocean, but still, the problem is that the waves are very close together, very steep, not giving the time to rise and fall over the waves like you could in the regular ocean. Instead, the waves crashed over the boat with punishing blows every few seconds. So it gives us an idea of what might have happened to the ship that Paul was on. Now, this was a harbor in Crete facing both west. Oh, Don, back to you. I'm talking about Fair Havens.
This is the harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea. When about midnight, the sailors sensed they were approaching land.
So you see the squiggly lines. They don't know what they're doing. They're just all this time being tossed and turned by the sea.
They took sounding and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight.
All right. Now, they say the feet, that's to help us. How did they take depths? How would they do the standings? They'd have a weight that they would drop. And how did they measure depth? Fathom. What is a fathom? This is a fathom. Because you take the rope and you go like that. 1 fathom, 2 fathoms, 3 fathoms. That's how they determine depth. All right? So using the equivalent from the fathoms, that's where we get the feet. And you see it's getting shallower.
In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow.
So what are they being tempted to do? To abandon the people, the passengers, so they can get away safely.
Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboats and let it drift away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food.
Now, why haven't they eaten? Obviously. Seasickness, yeah.
You needed to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. And when daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they let them in the sea and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow struck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or other pieces of ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely.
Miraculous almost.
Yeah.
See that happen. And they end up, main tradition is at modern day country of Malta. Did they make it to Malta, which is called Melita in there? Well, we talked in the sermon about the horned viper, which is a poisonous snake, but does not exist. There are no poisonous snakes on Malta. Maybe it was this place called Miljet that we talked about in the Bible story, in the sermon. It could have been there that that they went, but it doesn't match with the rest of the trip that's described by Luke. But what you see here is how not only the miracles, but also how God used the system set up by the Romans and how Paul used it, because Paul, by cooperating, by working with the things that he had as a Roman citizen, enabled him to have the position to travel all over, to influence people, and by being positive to the Roman government didn't promote the Christian faith, but they didn't stand in the way. In fact, they would protect people like Paul because they were law-obeying citizens, and they liked people who were law-obeying and who encouraged people to be law-abiding. And so by doing that, by working within that system, Paul was able to be and the early Christians to be very effective at their evangelism. This is like we see what's going on with Cabetta. He would do tree planting to prevent erosion, and the government found out they were doing. The government then started donating the trees for them to plant, and it was so successful. Now, in many respects, the government's taken it over completely, but what they did to start leaves them with a good impression from the government. And that's real important, because in order for them to have locations to build churches and schools, they need government approval. And the government approval is based on, are you doing something to improve the community? Well, if they set up these places to improve farming, schools, to educate kids, things like that, then the government approves it. And one of the important things about having that property, too, is they have space available to bury the dead. Because otherwise, the graveyards are all dominated by Muslims. And that's an obstacle people can becoming Christian and saying, well, what happens when I die or my relatives die? We're going to bury them. Well, now they don't have to worry about that. So there you see the example, that witness, how you can use that and how we can use our culture, our ability today to communicate, that be helpful that way. And so a lot of efforts to do evangelism made use of our technology. For years, our way of doing witness in Venezuela was dependent on buying commercial space on television, because it was too dangerous to go into the neighborhoods in Venezuela. But this way, they would attract people and have them come to places set up by the church where they could minister to them and witness to them. So we see how we can use our government, use our technology, use our culture to help advance the gospel. So you see that as well as these amazing thing with Paul and that shipwreck, because when you're getting close to a shore and you got rocks, the worst thing to do is stay in that ship, which is going to be thrown against there, and you'll crash with it. It would have been safer to get in the smaller boats and have them row, but of course, as we realized from Luke's story, they were just going to save their necks. And again, because Paul worked with the Roman officials, it's the Roman officials who guaranteed that didn't happen, which saved Paul and all the people on board. And of course, the snake thing, again, God's blessing work with Paul. But when Paul's executed, you don't have God miraculously rescuing him then. It was done to advance the gospel, not to impress people. Okay, any questions, thoughts on any of that?
It was interesting that the Romans, they didn't want any of those prisoners to escape.
Yeah, well, of course not. Of course they did. Yeah. Well, it's also because the officials, that was their job.
Well, yeah, I know.
And you follow orders.
Protecting themselves.
Yeah, you're following orders, and that's the orders, definitely. Yeah. And we see that too with when Paul is escorted from Jerusalem to Caesarea, that the Roman guard is going to protect him with their life because that's their order, to get him safely there, and they're going to obey that order. And therefore, the Jewish assassins didn't mess with him. And by the time they get to Caesarea, it's much safer because instead of Caesarea being dominated by the enemies of Jesus, the Jewish leaders, it's totally a Gentile city. It's dominated by the Roman government, and he's under their care.
I think it's amazing how much detail is written in the book of Acts about this shipwreck.
Yes, and tells us the reality of it. Because this isn't just some fanciful story. The fact, this is an eyewitness. You can tell it's a we thing, that Luke really experienced this, yeah. And also that, and we know that from sailors, that what they depict there is very accurate. And it also tells us about the kind of careful accountant that Luke was in writing his gospel and the book of Acts. Yeah. And understand, Luke is unique in the Bible. He's the only non-Israelite, non-Jew to write a book of the Bible. He's totally a Gentile. Okay. Any other thoughts? Let's pray. Dear Lord, we thank you for the witness of St. Paul and the other early Christian missionaries. We thank you for doing things miraculously to advance the gospel, to show that these people were really speaking your word. And we ask that you continue to work in our world through the even greater miracle, the gospel, the story that's been written down for us that we can share through your scriptures, and so that other people may come to faith as we are. Amen. All right.